record button for the folks at home, and this is for posterity now. So thank you all for tuning in to our ongoing series of faculty fireside chats. I'm Cliff. We're very pleased to have Saikat Chaudhuri here today. He is a professor in the M&A department here at Wharton. He used to co-teach the 721 class. As we were just talking before, he's heard the call, the Go West, my son business, and he'll be taking up a position at the Haas School and the Berkeley College of Engineering, even at a chancellor's endowed chair next semester. And so we wanted to get him in front of the camera before he left to share some of the wisdom and his thoughts and his research centered around the aviation industry. And so his interests include things like entrepreneurship, technology innovation, and there's lots of application there in the world of flight. So just to start off, Professor, tell us how aviation fits in your research and your interests, and what sort of brought you to work on it in academia and publish those articles.
No, thank you. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to really spend some time with you. I used to teach WEMBAs up until this past year. And then this year I moved on to something else, but I could have done it. It's online, but I look forward to engaging with you. And by the way, even though I'll move, I myself am actually a Penn and Wharton alum. So we'll always have a connection. So if anybody ever wants to get in touch afterwards, don't feel like, oh, this guy's gone off somewhere else. My loyalties as a Quaker are frankly, very, very strong. And to be very honest with you, between my undergrad days and my time teaching here, I spent literally half my life at Penn. So it's those roots and those ties will never go away. That much I assure you. But aviation has been one of those industries for me that's been fascinating. It started well before I think any kind of studying or commenting or advising in this space. I've always been fascinated by flying since I was a little kid. We would do it often, and in those days it wasn't as common to fly. It was fairly expensive, but we were expats. I was an Indian, or I am an Indian, but I grew up in Germany attending an American international school, and then I was in the States later as well, obviously, for my undergrad, master's, PhD, and then now I work here as well, and I worked in Europe in between. But given all that stuff, I was always traveling, and so we were traveling even as little kids everywhere, and so that really sparked my interest. In fact, frankly, had I not gone into this direction, I probably would have become a pilot, so I was one of those key geeks who played with Microsoft Flight Simulator when it first came out. And read everything about navigation and everything else in order to try and actually fly and land those planes, whether it's VFR, IFR, and all those things. But more formally, it's really through the M&A and alliance angle. And maybe to explain, my work has always been on external sourcing of innovation. So I've looked at M&A in the tech space, and that's really where my work started. How do you become innovative over time? And as a result, that's why I teach M&A, but also technological innovation at Wharton, because I was always, at the intersection, which meant I could do both, or at least have some excuse to do both. So it was really, I found a way to combine the interest in aviation with the professional interest more through the alliance and M&A angle. So a long time ago, about 14 years ago, I did a blueprint for the merger of Air India and Indian Airlines. Then I started working with Lufthansa a little bit, especially on Star Alliance and the expansion. Eventually, I also advised the American Airlines and US Airways merger transaction, and a few things like that here and there. And then I've been commenting. In fact, tomorrow morning, I have actually a really interesting conversation lined up with someone in the C-suite of Lufthansa. So it's I'm looking forward to that, to kind of think about what's going on right now and offer some of my thoughts. So those are the ways in which I got connected to aviation. It's really been a lifelong passion, and I use the other formal stuff more as an excuse to get into it.
Awesome. Well, and I hope that as part of your writer for professorship and everything, you include the most recent copy of Flight Simulator. Like, in Huntsman Hall, I'm sure there's like a sim area. We'll have to get one sent over to Cal. But moving on, moving to focus on the M&A, since that is your specialty, and I I read the article on Lufthansa and the Air India. It's posted on your faculty page. What really drives M&A in your opinion, and how is it different from other industries? You always hear about slot controls and limited city pairings. Is it more of a sort of merit, like an external force within the industry, or what really drives the the evolution over the past 10, 15 years?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're alluding to a number of the factors, but I mean, we tend to see these acquisitions and mergers in a number of scenarios. I mean, if it's oftentimes it happens during crises. So if you look at, say, a Lufthansa buying a Swiss Air, that really happened after there was a number of unfortunate incidents that Swiss had, one plane which crashed, and then after that, also with September 11th, you had some of this activity too. So airlines go under all the time. It's a capital intensive business. It's very difficult to sustain. There are always these shocks that come, whether it's a financial crisis or September 11th or now COVID, and many airlines don't survive that, right? The other piece of it, though, is really supply driven, this infrastructure constraint that you're talking about. This is not everywhere, but it really has to do with where there are slot constraints, such as in the New York area, or in Europe in particular. Like Lufthansa and Air Berlin was purely a play for slots in Dusseldorf. I mean, Berlin too, but Berlin is not, from a yield point of view, a very attractive market. So from a volume point of view, but not from a yield point of view, Dusseldorf is Germany's largest corporate market, Germany's largest origin destination market. And because the airport, long story short, was built in an area which is residential, it always had slot constraints. It's every year part of the top 5 most slot constrained airports in Europe, so it could never expand. In fact, that's why Munich became the second hub of Lufthansa, not because it was the biggest market. It's not by any means. In fact, it's very small and has heavy transfer, but it was because you couldn't get your hands on sufficient slots. Those are the reasons. But there's also the factor of pricing power, which you're really alluding to as well. And that has to do with being able to profitably run certain routes. Now, that also stems from a hub and spoke system. So if you look at it, especially the North American mergers, right, they were not driven by slot constraints. In the States, you don't tend to have that problem, except in the New York area. Building 5 or 6 runways here, like in Atlanta or even in Chicago, is not a problem. Land is available in the States. You don't have it in residential areas. Cities are usually, the airports are a little bit farther out. Those issues are not a problem, but it really has to do with, well, where can I achieve maximum pricing power? So take Philadelphia, for instance, American Airlines, US Airways, it was very interesting because Philly was an interesting market, and US Airways was quite dominant. And then American Airlines decided, well, it was really US Airways, when American Airlines was bankrupt, decided that let's make a play for American Airlines. And in fact, it was Doug Parker who had not succeeded with a similar kind of offer for Delta earlier. And that eventually forced the hand of American Airlines, and they brought the two together. So that led to Philadelphia actually gaining. One of the reasons, and I want to mention this because some of you are aviation geeks like I am, and I'm throwing around a lot of lingo, but I want to just explain a couple of things. In the airline industry, load factor, which is what percentage of my seats get filled, is important, but not as important as yield, which is the average price that I'm able to achieve, right? So Swiss actually is by far the most profitable within the Lufthansa group, but it has the lowest load factor of all, maybe sometimes 70, 75%, even during good times. But because Zurich is such a high-priced market, they really have a monopoly there, they're able to achieve really high prices for every ticket or per passenger kilometer. And as a result, that's what matters a lot. The term OND I used earlier is origin destination. So when you look at airports, you can't just judge by how many passengers fly through there. For example, Atlanta has been for a long time the largest airport in terms of passenger numbers, but it's not the largest local market. It's because it's a hub that it has a lot of flights. Or Charlotte is an even better example. Charlotte, only 20% of the traffic in Charlotte actually comes from Charlotte. It's a nice city and all that, but 80% is transit traffic, and so that's the other factor. So the more I can get control over certain cities and build fortress hubs in them, where I have this maybe 60%, 70% of the market share, the more I'm able to increase my pricing as well, which is good sometimes for the locals because you get more nonstops, even if the price is higher. So I think those are the 3 factors that are driving a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, and there's also probably an ongoing role for government even after deregulation. It seems, whether it's the development of a better air traffic control system to let more planes actually land in New York and ease some of the congestion there, or Southwest's favorite or least favorite amendment, the Wright Amendment, that
Yes.
saw the growth of Dallas Fort Worth over Love Field. So.
Absolutely. And in
Yeah,
fact, yeah, go ahead.
I was to say, how do you see the role of government, continuing to evolve? And of course, there's been some big cash infusions in the past few
Yeah.
months into the space.
Yeah, governments will always be involved in airlines. I mean, many consider airlines to be a very fundamental, industry that's the essence of national security in some ways, and certainly national infrastructure. But the role has been interesting, right? Even today, we have so many restrictions on how many flights you can have between one country or another. So one controversy that you may have heard is an open skies agreement between the United States and, say, the Middle East. And you know that Emirates and Etihad and Qatar are known for very high quality service at low prices, which is an amazing combination. But also they're heavily subsidized by the respective countries, right? And you can make arguments for or against. I'm not going to wade into that debate, because even Singapore Airlines is heavily subsidized. The reason is some countries also view this as a way to attract tourism, for instance, right? So they spread the cost across. So if even if they offer lower prices and they lose a little on that, if someone comes and stays in Singapore and spends a lot of money in Singapore, then that's more than made up for at the national level. And this is for state-owned enterprises, right? So I think you'll always have that. You'll have the cash infusion of the national carriers. You'll have that. But I think the restrictions on the flights and the capacity are always something. Canada does the same. So the Middle Eastern airlines have not been able to get in, and Air Canada actually is very protected. And as a result, though, if you look at it, it also has many nonstop flights, so you don't have to connect in Dubai or in Abu Dhabi or in Doha in order to reach a lot of destinations. So I'm not even saying, I think there's pluses and minuses in that. It's the same thing with low cost carriers, by the way. That's another area where governments are getting involved. Because should there be a minimum price, whether for ecological or environmental reasons? Austria, for example, has imposed something like that as part of the bailout agreement for Austrian airlines. They've said that no, but we also will impose a minimum price. And that's designed to counter the low cost carriers. Now, you may wonder, is that a good thing? Well, the question is having Norwegian Airlines really positive? On the one hand, you'll say, of course, because I can get cheap flights to Europe. On the other hand, if it's artificially dragging down the profitability, it also means that everybody struggles. And that race to the bottom that we see in terms of what we get may not be something that all of us like, frankly. So how do you balance that? In all these ways, it's important. And then finally, you've got these joint venture agreements and code shares and so forth, right? Which airlines are able to compete jointly as partners, but protected from traditional antitrust concerns and restrictions. That's another area. So undoubtedly, government will remain involved in the sector. I can't imagine this not happening anymore.
And speaking of all the cash getting thrown around, it seems like airlines are spending their money on all sorts of crazy things. We have Etihad's bit of irrational exuberance. There's sort of acquisition expeditions with Air Italy and Air Serbia and so forth. And American Airlines, they make a profit, they do a stock buyback, which kind of ruffled some feathers for folks. So looking at it from either like a value creation perspective or a priority perspective, what's your thoughts behind those decisions? Or is it the optimal choice that they should be making?
No, I think it can make sense, but you can't I think the exuberance part is what is really important that you mentioned. You can't get carried away. So like you said, Etihad's problem it wasn't a bad strategy. I'll be very honest. Emirates was the airline that was growing very quickly and through organic means. And Abu Dhabi and Etihad couldn't do that. So they decided to use a stakes strategy, minority stakes, and they would usually take stakes in struggling carriers. I would actually argue that went wrong, not so much because it was a bad strategy to take stakes, more because the implementation was poor. if you look at all the stakes that they took, they never did much with those. I mean, the only thing that they did was try and funnel a whole bunch of traffic to Abu Dhabi. That made no sense. I mean, and especially in the European carriers' cases, they had bases in Europe that they could build out to hubs as a way to get, take advantage of so-called fifth freedom rights, which meant that these carriers could then travel all the way to North America, picking up valuable passengers from Europe. And that's important because you make more money. Like, when you travel to somewhere in Asia via Europe, whether it's BA or Lufthansa, they don't make as much money on someone who travels all the way from North America to Asia as they do on the passenger that goes transatlantic separately and then goes from there to Asia separately. So you kind of want both. And that's the traffic that they could have easily picked up along the way, and they didn't implement it correctly. Delta is an interesting one because I think they're starting to get carried away a little bit because they have stakes in so many airlines. But what Delta is doing is actually slightly different. I think their moves are a bit more thought out. They're either doing it to get access to slots, like the Virgin stake, for example, is all about London Heathrow. And getting access to that and trying to compete with BA in some way. And if you look at it that way, that's one. But if you look at also what they're doing with LATAM, LATAM was part of Oneworld. And so, essentially stealing them from Oneworld and bringing them into their fold without yet introducing them into SkyTeam has been a great way to disturb the other alliance and get access, So I think there can be very strategic reasons for it. You just can't get carried away with how much you do. The stock buyback thing, what I think the point of criticism that we can offer right now to the airlines is, given the profits that they've all made in the last 5-6 years, especially the North American carriers, at somewhere to the tune of $4 to $6 billion a year, it's really the amount of reserves they kept as a percentage of that was quite low. So it's not that they I understand COVID is something exogenous, but it's really something where we would have expected them to have more money on hand. Now, they will argue that they're spending the money on new aircraft and so forth, which is not untrue. But, if you look at it, fleet acquisition isn't all. The buybacks are actually an essential component of it. And that was done to also prop up the stock price and keep that going higher at strategic times. So you could really, some of those decisions I think are questionable.
Well, and Doug said, the stock will never fall below a certain amount, and it's done that since. So I definitely see that. One other question in the M&A space and the acquisition, as in Professor Singh's class, we're looking at the targets, the acquisitions, and then the integrations.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if you could comment a little bit about the culture fit. In some cases, American Airlines and U.S. Airways just recently had a joint pilot agreement. They just recently had a joint flight attendant agreement. Virgin America, Alaska didn't seem like they would meld very well together. And then you even have, like you mentioned before, where US Air essentially takes over American, installs US management under the flag of American Airlines. So how is that shaken out, and what have been some factors for success or lack thereof?
Yeah, integration is a huge, as you know, in any M&A deal, integration plays a huge role, and aviation and airlines are no different. I think, a great example of a success story is actually Delta and Northwest. Some of the other ones that you're mentioning have had all kinds of hiccups along the way. I think, the culture is one thing. One thing you have to remember is, in a transaction, you have to think about, where is my value coming from? If my value is coming from people compared to, say, processes and assets, it's a little bit harder. So in a tech world, if Cisco buys another firm or Google buys somebody, and if people leave, you've got a problem. So culture plays a huge role in that. If you look at it realistically, though, the aviation industry is one where, if you can get routes and networks optimized, if you can get hubs optimized, if you actually are able to harmonize your fleet, if you're able to have seniority lists combined, these kinds of things, you'll be able to make it work. I hate to say it, but to some extent, the people are genericized in a lot. Not if you go to, say, a Singapore Airlines or Thai Airways, very distinctive types of airlines, right? But in a lot of the North American transactions, it was much more, a bit more genericized. There aren't unique value propositions in terms of service that they offer and that they play up, shall we say. I'm not saying good or bad, I'm just saying in how they present it. So the ones who did the operational integration really well they did well. It's sort of like, in oil and gas, where we've had a lot of mergers and acquisitions in general over time. And it's been about, optimal processes that you adopt to drill and things like that, and so those are some of the things. And the cost synergies play a big role. So that's been something. But now look at it. If you buy very distinctive airlines, like it's hard to buy a Virgin because Virgin has such a unique character to it and it's so associated with Richard Branson, for instance. Integrating that service culture with anything else is going to be very difficult, so that's where it comes. So when you speak of Alaska and Virgin America, I think some people feel that the integration has gone so well. I personally feel that we've lost the whole Virgin touch, and Alaska Airlines is a very well-run airline. It's not that. In fact, it's amazing how they've been able to beat back some of the bigger majors like Delta encroaching on their territory in Seattle and so forth. But it's, I kind of liked this unique offering of Virgin America, in terms of service, in terms of seats and all these things. And we've lost that a little bit, right? So integration plays a big role, but it's a lot about, getting those hubs and processes and routes harmonized and anything else. The other part which plays a role is fleet. If you don't have a harmonious fleet, if you have too many aircraft types, it makes for a very expensive operation. Especially for maintenance reasons. So quickly harmonizing your fleet is really important. And that's one of the things that you see happening. Like the Airbus aircraft that Virgin had are going to be gone at some point at Alaska as well. There are a handful, being that are left. And the excuse of COVID is just being used to get rid of them, even though they had planned that earlier too.
Yeah, and of course, with the culture, it even comes down to the safety videos, and it's hard to acquire a Southwest, and then you see like,
that's right.
When are you going to see like a Virgin America safety video again? Probably not on Americans going for great. So yeah, I hear you there. We had a question from Marlis actually, and I should say, I'm monitoring the chat. Also feel free to chime in as well for the folks on the stream. Shifting a little bit to COVID, as you mentioned, it's not only delaying the fleet integration on Alaska. It's shocked the industry pretty much like nothing else. How do you see consolidation going in the industry, and the travel is the one thing that's been probably most quickly hit and most strongly hit in this crisis. So what's it look like for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's there. But Marlis, did you want to ask a question or
sorry,
make a comment or anything? And
Sure. Can you hear me?
of course, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so actually, if you think about after COVID, right? So let's fast forward, assuming second quarter next year, right? Let's keep our finger crossed. So do you expect further consolidation in the industry? Do you expect maybe further retraction because people learn how, hey, you know what, I can get my job done without traveling? Or do you expect further expansion? I mean, what are your thoughts there? I would love to hear that from you.
Absolutely, and that ties actually really well into Cliff, what you were talking about as well, and COVID and its after effects. I'll take it in sort of two stages. By the way, one thing I wanted to mention to you guys, we're throwing, Cliff is very well versed in the industry and others are too. In case some of you are not, there's no stupid question here. Like if you didn't follow any of the arguments or the points that I'm making, and you're here to just understand something about the industry, I don't want it to be something just for insiders, so please feel free to ask something really basic, so that we can all enjoy that. I'm really happy to break it down. I'm just passionate about it like these guys are. In aviation, what happens is there's something called aviation geeks, so they get really into it and they talk in all this lingo and assume a lot of stuff. But I don't want that to be a barrier for anybody. So really, please don't be shy. I also have the chat here so I can see it. COVID is a really interesting challenge because it's unprecedented, like you guys said. And not only that, it's coming on the back of record-breaking passenger numbers and flights, right? I mean, it was really incredible to see. So, there are a few factors to consider. Because of the immense financial hit, and because it's a survival issue, that's why I do expect further consolidation. In fact, this winter is always historically a season which is really bad for airlines. And you have to make your money in the summer, the record profits during the summer, and then winter, you somehow have to minimize the losses. And then in the so-called shoulder seasons, which are the fall and then the spring, you manage to sort of break even or eke out some sort of profit. That's sort of how the industry works, But because of the winter and it's so bad, and in some places traffic has gone down, like in Europe, to 10%. And so it's going to be a bloodbath. It's going to be a bloodbath. A number of airlines are going to go under. Norwegian and others are not receiving a second bailout. So there's no question in my mind there will be more consolidation. And so I think that's a given. In terms of the overall dynamics, let me first talk to now, and then what I think will happen from 2021, maybe mid-year onwards. And of course, the vaccine is a big factor. I see two stages in the industry. There's sort of the now part, and then there's the recovery part, and then there's and now and recovery are a little bit intertwined. And then after that comes really when we get back to some stage of normalcy. Now what's happening is there's some really interesting dynamics going on, right? For one, you have three factors that are determining which flights are operating. One is this origin destination traffic. Another is, have you always been a hub? But a third is cargo. So for instance, Singapore Airlines is flying currently between Zurich and Singapore. On average, there are about 10 passengers per day on that plane. So how the heck do you make money on it? Or are they running a loss? They're actually eking out a small profit. And that's because cargo is 3 times as profitable as it was earlier. Why would that be the case? Supply and demand, if you think about it, demand for cargo may have gone down a little bit, but not really. We still need to ship goods and services. Whatever dip there is in terms of industrial output is more than compensated for by medical supplies. So let's call it roughly the same. Supply has gone down tremendously because cargo is both transported by dedicated freighter aircraft, as well as, so Atlas Air and other airlines like that, or for example, the cargo divisions of airlines, Korean Air Cargo, for example. It's not as popular in North America, but elsewhere it is. Now, if you think about it, what's happened is all this belly capacity. In other words, passenger flights also carry cargo in their belly, so to speak, underneath where the seats are. All that capacity is gone because there's so few passenger flights, which means demand is roughly the same. Supply is much lower in terms of flights. And so the price for cargo has gone up dramatically right now. So that's also affecting it. So if you've got some combination of some local demand with cargo and hub status, then that will explain a lot of what the route networks are about. There's another factor though. What are the passengers? Who are the passengers who are traveling? Normally we've got 3 types of travel. We've got business travel, we've got tourism, and we've also got what's called VFR, so visiting friends and relatives. Right now, number 1 is visiting friends and relatives. Number 2, to some extent, is tourism, but that's usually locally or regionally. And then what's far off right now is business travel. The trouble is, and this is what Marlis was getting at as well, the real question for us is post-COVID, how much will business travel pick up? Because the airlines made their money on business passengers, not only business class and first class, but also in economy, because those are the ones who pay for the unrestricted tickets, the expensive tickets, not the cheap ones. So the question is really that. My own view is we are people. We're humans. We want to connect. We want to travel. Even if it'll take time, we want to go back to it. This whole work from home thing, I definitely think there'll be some permanent impact. There's what we'll have is we'll have some sort of efficiency. I don't think though it's going to be the case that you just want to work from home, even though people are arguing productivity levels are high and so forth. There are also a lot of downsides the longer this drags on that we see. For example, innovation output in terms of radical new innovation is down. And the reason it's down is because all the serendipitous work that happens over the water cooler when you're together in different places, that's not programmable. You can't have a Zoom meeting to organize innovation, incremental stuff happens that way. And so that business development, sure, right now nobody has a choice. So investment bankers are getting new deals by Zooming with their clients, or consultants are able to complete existing projects from afar. The moment somebody gets a deal by wining and dining the client, for example, is the moment when everybody else is going back to that. Sure, as I'm implementing my consulting project, I don't necessarily need to, if I'm at McKinsey or BCG or Bain, perhaps I don't need to go every Monday to Thursday to my client site. Maybe I'll go every 2 weeks, or I'll go for 2 days a week or something like that. But I don't think it's going to be permanently changed. We can't develop relationships, for example. Even if you want to do office politics, you can't do that here. Think about all your situations. All the relationships you have already are being reinforced. The ones you don't have, all the new people or building cultures in a firm, none of that's happening. Startups are suffering. They hate this. Some of the biggest tech companies like Google and all that, why did they have fancy campuses? Because they didn't want people to work from home. They wanted people on campus staying from preferably something like 6 in the morning till 10 or to 11 p.m. at night, giving you all the meals on campus. And if you want, there are futons available too, so you don't leave, right? So all of that stuff will be adjusted, but at the same time, I don't think it's going away. Now, given that, I think what will happen is there will be a dip because we're not going to go back immediately to the same number. So that's why I think people are projecting 2024, 2025 is when we get back. I think we'll go back up, not because business travel, it's not that we'll start doing 100% business travel for any given project, but what will happen is over time, like we've always seen, travel keeps going up in general. And so even if my business does 20% less and continues that on a given project, because overall we'll have more and more volume, more companies, economies will expand, more mobility across, people, that's what's going to drive it in the long run. But, in the short term, what this means is I need to focus a bit more on the leisure passenger and the, which nobody's paid attention to, really wait for that business segment to pick up. So those are my predictions for what's going to happen afterwards.
Yeah, and also different airlines have taken different strategies as well. Like you've seen like American and the US ones pivot towards serving that leisure market, revamping their loyalty program to be kinder to the infrequent flyer. And then you have someone like Air New Zealand that basically told their investors that we will be a domestic airline for the next year. Qantas isn't scheduling flights until a year from now, even with a vaccine. So yeah.
Yeah, and these travel restrictions are really, international travel is going to be what's going to take a longer time to recover, right? The domestic and regional, we already see different places picking up. And by the way, when it comes to COVID, you apply just one brush. You have to think about it more broadly. Asia, in some places, is back to 70, 80%. I mean, China is an exception with 100 or even 105% compared to last year. But in general, we're sort of seeing some things domestically within the US there, we'll see during Thanksgiving time up to 50% capacity. And so I think that's really important to consider as well. I totally agree with you. The restrictions of the governments are going to play another important role. What I love about airlines and why I want to make a pitch for you guys to also get into it is you can learn so much. Right now, think about the adaptation these guys are having to do. Literally, based on a second wave coming, all of a sudden capacity is like shrunk from 50% to like 20%. Or you see city pairs that are being launched to all these Caribbean destinations, which are still accessible in order to increase that, right? I mean, it's really remarkable in such an industry where you have to optimize operations to do these things. It's so cool. Think about what you can learn and what kind of a stomach you have to have in order to manage these things and adjust. So it's really great. I see there's one interesting question from Cesar in the chat, which is, would this imply lower business and first class fares, people that actually pay for their own flights? Yes. In fact, you're seeing that. I was casually checking Philadelphia to San Francisco the other day, and economy fares are actually not that much lower than they typically are during the season. Remember, November is not, prime season. So 300, 400 bucks is very, you would normally get too. But the first class fares are down to sometimes $800, whereas normally they'd be $1,200, $1,300, $1,500, $1,600. So they are definitely down because they also want to attract the leisure traveler who's high end, who's willing to pay for that seat, and that's also important. And you get that to vary ones. There's a great question or a point by David about the best time to find award redemptions and upgrades is in the shoulder season. Yes. Right now, though, if you're willing to take a risk, you can pretty much get it for, like, say, peak season, like next summer as well. And I don't think it's much of a risk because they have generous change policies too. So it's not like normally. So if you really want to go somewhere where you normally don't get redemption opportunities, then you can book it and then adjust those things if you still have restrictions, yeah. And Shiv, I think you're also saying something. Don't want to steer the conversation too far away from airlines, but value creation in aviation is largely in airline, IT, and manufacturers. Both have higher return on invested capital, whereas airlines are minus this percent in those areas. And what's on the horizon for those businesses? I think these are great points. What I want to say about airlines, though, the reason we have this -6 is because we have a lot of bankruptcies too. So it's one of those things like M&A too. You can't look at the mean. You have to look at the variance, because there's some really strong performers who do well. and then others who don't, so that's one caveat. But yes, information technology, and then, the aircraft manufacturers, I mean, they have been making more money historically. Absolutely true. Warren Buffett famously said, I don't like investing in airlines, even though he does all the time. But, and he has bought stock again after dumping it all a few months ago. But I think you're right. It's one of those things. But from a volume point of view, you can do pretty well. And it's one of those essential industries, that we need.
And David has a question on IT, and then we can actually talk more about entrepreneurship as well. So David, you can ask or we can read.
Yeah, sorry, I've been reading, but actually it's
no, it's fine either way.
Say something.
Well, yeah, my question's on the topic of airline IT. In terms of consolidation, we see a lot of it there as well, with Sabre and Amadeus being the two dominant airline IT providers. What kind of insights do you have from that kind of observation?
Whether it's airlines, whether it's aircraft manufacturers, whether it's software and IT systems for the airline, everything is very consolidated. And one of the reasons is either it's very capital intensive, which applies to the airlines and applies to the manufacturers, or like in the case of software, is you've locked it in. And once you have reservation systems, not only with you, but also interoperability with your alliance partners, nobody wants to change that system because it's such a headache. Systems integration becomes even worse than typically. So I think it's one of the explanations there. The other piece of it, and here's when I get a little provocative, and it really ties nicely to Cliff, the next theme is, one thing is that aviation hasn't seen much disruption, to be very honest with you. And let me make that point, just more broadly. There are many industries which haven't seen much disruption. It's been information technology based businesses where we really saw a lot of disruption, but it's only in the last 5 or 7 years we see true attempts. Like, for example, in the car industry too, the car looks the same as 100 years ago. It's a little bit faster and a little bit safer, but frankly, it's not revolutionary. It's all incremental. Airplanes. I mean, the jet engine, the Boeing 707 was the first of these modern jet engines. That was a 1960s product. So yeah, the Dreamliner, people get excited about a 20% greater fuel efficiency, 30% maybe compared to the stuff back then, or 35. I mean, that's not much compared to anything. It's like pharmaceuticals is another industry, in the drug industry. We still take 10 years for product development. We still use combinatorial chemistry. Why I'm saying this in these industries is, and in cancer treatment, luckily we're starting to see CAR T treatments and all that. We still use chemo and chemotherapy and radiation therapy. I mean, my goodness, I always joke with doctors and they don't like it. I open something and saying, how would you like to have advanced, very fancy landlines, but have never seen a smartphone before and a mobile phone? They're like, I wouldn't like it. I'm like, well, that's kind of what the rate of innovation in medicine. And they're really mad. I say, well, sorry, but telling a cancer patient that I have great news for you, that you have an 80% expectant, survival rate for 5 years is not really where we should be after trillions of dollars research. Now, all knocking on all those industries aside, the problem is these are much more complex. There are many more factors, and you can't have a beta version of an aircraft or anything like that because the thing has to fly. It's not like putting out a product and iterating, so it's a lot harder. Why am I saying this stuff though, right? I mean, on the innovation side, I think there's a lot more we can do. Whether it's how we do reservations, how the customer interacts, how planes or even aircraft look. Do we even need aircraft? I mean, maybe there are other modes of transportation that can get us from point A to point B. I'm happy about, Hyperloop and all these experiments going on because, for certain routes, maybe that's the solution, and others, it might not be. It's just so that we happen to have cars and buses and trains and aircraft right now, but we haven't seen anything modern. The next big thing that's happening is all kinds of alternative fuel, whether it's hydrogen-based stuff, whether it's biofuels, and there are lots of experiments running. I think that's really important, and that will be a major step forward, and I would argue something revolutionary, but something that's truly breakthrough would be an entirely new a new design, something that looks completely different perhaps also, or flies in a very different way, if it flies at all, in order to transport people from point A to point B. And we haven't seen that in a while, so that's really what I think is going on.
And building off a question that Shiv pinged me privately on innovation, you have this idea of in-house innovation. You have, JetBlue Technology Ventures, you have A with Airbus. You read all these things, but yet, the seats look basically the same. You're not seeing like the yoga studio or the the capsule hotel on a plane right now.
Yeah.
So, what's your take on company innovation and the the inertia behind even like an iPad on an in-flight entertainment would be a step above what's on some planes.
It's currently there, yeah. I think it's the classic incumbency problem. We always see in every industry those established market leaders, it's harder and harder for them to be innovative, partly because it's in their interest to keep things the same, but also really because they've optimized along a certain set of factors. So my view on this is just like in finance, where you have a whole bunch of big banks, for example, or in energy, where you've got the Exxon Mobils of this world that are really slow, at least Shell and others are doing something, but you need disruptors. You need new companies. If you take a look at Tesla, it doesn't matter if Tesla survives or not. Well, it may matter to some people. But what I'm trying to say is that the move to electric vehicles will have been completed. That's Tesla's legacy. In other words, Volvo already committed under Chinese ownership to do that. Even Daimler and everybody else has already committed to move to electric. That's happening. So it's not that the romanticized notion that a startup or a disruptor needs to come in and replace the existing giant. That won't happen in capital-intensive industries or ones where customers or compliance are very important, like in banks. You need these startups to do all kinds of fintechs in order to disrupt the industry with alternative payment systems. But frankly, someone has to understand risk management and what to do with money. Someone has to have the compliance. Someone has to have the customers. And the big banks pairing up with these new people, new players in the ecosystem, whether through acquisition or partnership, is one way forward, right? And I think the same thing applies here. We need completely new models, new ways of thinking about it. That's not going to come from the traditional players. It should come from the others. And then we need to hook in the big players, because nobody else has the deep pockets and the long time horizons and the appetite for all the uncertainty to take it forward, right? If you take a look at Boeing, people are criticizing Boeing right now and versus Airbus, for example, right? Boeing took a big gamble on the 787. It argued that we're going to have more point-to-point traffic, long haul. We don't need to have hub and spoke. If we can create a wide-body aircraft that's much more fuel efficient and smaller, otherwise, for example, Austin, London would never be feasible, and certainly not San Diego, Tokyo. Nice city, San Diego, but in terms of the volume that it needs, especially up front. So it's the same thing, and Airbus bet on the 380, and they did it because European airports tend to be slot constrained, but there are not enough takers for that kind of an aircraft. Today, it looks a little different because the narrow body equivalent, the Airbus 321 XLR, extra long range, is going to be a game changer, because the likes of JetBlue can launch all of a sudden in one go 18 or 20 different destinations from the East Coast to Europe, and others can go from Europe to Africa and Asia, and all of a sudden bypass the major hubs. And they have a little bit of an advantage with COVID, because we're not going to be able to fill these big planes for a while. So the new 777, even though it will have utility afterwards, the 777X, it's going to take a little bit of time, or the A220, which is the former C series by Bombardier.
Well, and you even see like Qantas hasn't sold their A380s; they've just parked it in the desert for that some far off future. So
yeah, my secret prediction though is I don't think we're going to take till 2024, and this goes back to the earlier question by Marlis too. I don't think we may take technically till 2024 or so, or 2025 to reach like the absolute numbers, but to get something like 80% there, I think we're going to be able to achieve it much faster than that, because people are, the behavior of work from home and people staying at home, the longer this continues, we're going to get antsy. This is going to be a long winter, unfortunately. People are going to get antsy. As soon as they can get a vaccine, at least the frequent travelers, as soon as something opens up a little bit by next summer, and especially the latter part of that year and then beginning of 2022, I predict a much faster recovery, even if businesses will take a little while also due to the economic hit. It's going to be at like 70 to 80% is my prediction in 2022, even if it takes longer than that to get to the 100% level, which I don't, it's not a big deal as far as I'm concerned.
And I think Ryan and Stephanie both had some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. And please talk. I'm sorry I was reading out the questions earlier, but you guys, I want to hear from you and get to know you even in this virtual format.
Well, yeah, Ryan, you want to take your innovation question, then we'll do Stephanie,
Sure.
and then we'll look at Andrew's fintech.
There's a couple different operation disruption models that are out there. One in a lot of different kind of parts of aviation. Some of the ones that are on this Uber for the skies feels like it's a very trite phrase, and there have been like many blow-ups and a lot of capital put into those. So you've got things like Blade in New York City, and then like a Surf Air model on the West Coast. I don't know if you're familiar with any of those models, but or what's your thought on some of the rather than the equipment innovation
Yes.
on the business model innovation?
Absolutely. I think that's great. And for me, the more experimentation that I see going on, the more heartened I feel that we're going to come up with something that works. The struggle right now with any of those models is that it's still very expensive. And so, you know, what's happening, they're trying different membership models, for example, like with Surf Air, right? And Bleed and others are coming in handy because there are all kinds of people in New York City who are in finance and they love going into the office for the day and have some meetings and going back to parts of Long Island then and retreat again in the Hamptons and places like that. So there are all kinds of interesting things, or Surf Air also has particular clientele. You know what will really be a game changer? Here's why. So I did a little bit of work. Actually, I had one in one of my courses on technological innovation. I have some live projects, and one of the projects was to work on Uber Elevate and work on the whole air taxi service as well. So I got a little bit of a window. I think that's the kind of thing we need from a business point of view, right? We have to somehow find the lower cost and the higher volume type of model for that to really take off. Now, what'll be interesting is that I think we'll segment the market, right? There's sort of a local commute type model. There might be a little bit of a regional area model, and then there's something which is farther. And then the farther stuff, the farther you go, the harder it becomes to have something of that sort, right? So yes, you could argue that the upper middle class may be able to take advantage of private jet services now, but that's really like still a small clientele. So I like all these things. I do believe there's a future for them, but the price point has to really come down and we have to make it up with volume. The other thing we have to figure out is how do we manage all this safely and the infrastructure? I mean, I like the idea of, you know, parking lots and tall buildings for these kinds of, for where you can land with these so-called VTOLs, you know, the vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. All that's great, but it needs to be very convenient, you know, for me to get there, and I have to be able to access it and do all these things. So there's a lot of stuff that has to be worked out, but I love this experiment. You know, I mean, without this, Ryan, we're not going to be able to get to any of the new stuff. So I believe in it, but what I also believe is there'll be a lot more segmentation of the market. I give you 3 crude categories and how people think about the market right now. I think there's going to be a lot more segmentation. Then think about it in terms of the different kinds of countries. There are countries like the US, which are very spread out. That's why the US has by far more airports per capita than anywhere else. Whereas other places are very densely populated, you know, so you can't have the same kind of solution in those places. Maybe trains are a better idea, and high-speed trains. So there's going to be variation. That's sort of my view on it, but I love all that experimentation.
Awesome. And Stephanie, we'll take a look at your question and then Artur as well. So.
Hi, my question is very related to Ryan's question about air taxis, but related, what are your thoughts about the all-electric self-flying air taxis that are being developed?
Yeah, those are being developed, and you know, it's only befitting because we have, you know, autonomous vehicles of all kinds. So why not directly incorporate that technology into these things? In fact, even larger aircraft are moving down to 1 pilot instead of 2, being able to control aircraft from afar. All these things may seem like fantasy, but all of it's happening. I think this is all real. I mean, if you go back, there's a cartoon that most of you guys won't have seen, but it's called The Jetsons. The Jetsons was a cartoon where this family flies around in spacecraft and drops kids off at school like that and all these other things. We're going to have to find creative ways of living in the space we have. What we've underexplored is sort of certain parts of the sky and other places too. I believe this, but you know, the thing is, it's going to take a little bit of time, Stephanie, is my view, because, you know, to have the safety standards in place and have the reliability in place, is hard enough on the ground. So you see how autonomous vehicles perform, and we're first going to try those on highways with trucks, where there are minimal other interference. What has to accompany it, though, and here's where I think the bottleneck is all kinds of other things in the ecosystem, enabling infrastructure. We have to have the air traffic control and manage all that stuff. We have to also come up with insurance plans that work with self, driving or self-controlled type of vehicles, or ones that are remote controlled, let's say even. And that's also has to be there. Even with cars on the ground, we're not there yet. People are unsure what happens if an autonomous vehicle, for example, crashes. So whose fault is it? The software maker, the maker of the car, the quote unquote driver of the vehicle? We don't know. So I think there's a lot of stuff, but I do believe we'll get there. And I know a lot of people are afraid, but I'm sure at some point in time, people were afraid of buses and cars, and they were afraid of planes, when they first came to. So, no, but give it a little bit of time, maybe a decade or so, 5 to 10 years, we'll see some real progress is my view.
All right, and Artur, you want to ask your question about the easiest way to buy miles?
Sure. Thanks for the opportunity. I've been really enjoying this. My question has to do with, well, your experiences in M&A, but I'm curious about, when should two things that are a single entity actually be split up, right? When the sum of the value of the two parts is greater than the whole, and especially now with all of the airlines mortgaging their loyalty programs, there's been a lot of buzz about loyalty programs.
Yeah.
So I'd just like to hear your general thoughts on the value of those programs.
Look, if you have, in what's happening across industries is people have different sources of revenue. And so if you take another industry like publishing, it kind of went through like newspapers. They went through an initial model, which was subscription-based. Then we went to an ad-based model, and now we're back to both subscription and ad. And media is the same. We went through Netflix makes money by subscription, which was the old model of doing things before we had the ads, And so every industry has multiple ways of making money. And during certain periods of time, there's value in different pieces. For the airlines, it's been the loyalty piece, right? And so that's why Delta mortgages its loyalty program. There are many airlines which have spun out their loyalty program. So Air Canada was one of the first to do it with Aeroplan, for instance. And they've been very successful with it, right? So the whole buying and selling of miles and offering it to your credit card company who buys a whole bunch of them, and then you do transactions, and then they essentially make some money off of the margin. The merchants get charged a fee. Some of that goes to buying miles or paying rather for your miles. The other piece they keep in their pockets. I think there's so many ways of doing it. It's very important. So I completely agree with you. All these assets can be decoupled. In general, I think the instances where I've seen it being successful is if you can sell the thing off and thereby expand the kinds of vendors that you can bring into the network of your loyalty program, while at the same time not sacrificing the loyalty to your airline. And that's really a function of how well you orchestrate the deal and the contract of the usage afterwards, and so we can do that. And that's really good. There are plenty of airlines, though, that like to keep their loyalty programs because it is bringing them so much money, and it is a great cash cow. So as long as that remains, I do see it a little bit more of what you see as during crisis periods. That's when people think about selling it. But it's such a great business that it's nice to keep that cash cow because it compensates for a lot of other things, especially because we're not sure how ancillary fees will come back. So, airlines had been starting to unbundle and, for your luggage and everything else, food and so forth, they started to charge you. And of course, change fees too. Now they've had to make all that much more flexible, and they can't charge you for a whole bunch of things given these circumstances. And it's a little unclear how quickly they're going to be able to get back to those ancillary fees. So in the meantime, you need to make money somewhere, and loyalty programs are going to be very important, especially if we get back to flying. But even if we don't, because that loyalty buildup, it's something which you can even use now, so that's why it's good. It's very mortgageable right now, even though people are not flying as much.
All right.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good point. I hadn't quite thought about the fact that, yeah, you can make a quick buck off of it now, but probably better to keep it around in the long term.
Yeah.
Like privatizing toll roads, I guess.
That's right. Yeah. You get cash. Cash is important in this business. So it's like, yeah.
So we're currently like we're in a holding pattern around around Philadelphia, waiting to land the plane on our amazing hour of conversation. So are there other questions from the folks on the call, and we can wrap up with rapid fire questions as well. So, and any other questions for folks?
Yeah, if you hey guys, Cliff, if you don't mind, I'm gonna ask a question.
Yeah, go for it.
Thanks for Professor. This has been really great. I recently read an article about similar to how airline companies use oil futures and the derivatives market to hedge against volatility and fuel costs, that they're about to do the same with swings and ticket fares. So having a derivative market to hedge against short-term volatility in tickets, which I thought was a really kind of innovative way to kind of smooth out kind of volatility for incoming revenue. And I thought that was a really great example of disruption on the fintech side. And so I just want to hear you comment on any other examples or any other ideas of how fintech could be a disruptor in the airline industry.
I think that's a great example. And I'm going to give you one more. First of all, by the way, the fuel hedging hasn't been going so well this year. So everybody's partly losing the billions because they hedged on the fuel. But that aside, in general, they do that. I think what you propose, or the idea that you were talking about is really a neat one, because airlines are thinking about how do they take that risk, I mean, the traditional risk that they have, and what can they do with it? Another example of what you're talking about, a related example, is what to do with the inventory of seats that remains. We all know about the perishability of these airline seats. And there are, it's not clear that airlines being the holding the seats and being the ones who sell these seats in some way is the best way of doing it. You can imagine all kinds of marketplaces for open seats that can arise. Now, the reason some of that, so there are some efforts underway at that. There was the model of, say, the price lines earlier, where you can't see who the airline, that was the original price line. You can't see who the airline is or the hotel company is, but they give you a discount. That's one model. But the other thing is, if we could trade that inventory and we could do something with it, for instance, in a marketplace where I can bid on something, I need to get from point A to point B, and it's sort of a mixed bag, and there's some intermediary that makes some money as well. That may be a more efficient mechanism than each airline keeping this inventory to themselves and then releasing it. So that's one more example that I've seen. The issue that's run into is who is then responsible for the ticket, as in that seat. Is it still the airline, or is it now the company that actually sold you that seat, which may not be the airline, right? So that exchange, let's say. So there are a lot of legal ramifications of this, and they've gotten stuck in that. I think these are some of the things that can happen. You can also have, if you look at it, there's so many risks that can happen. Traditional insurance is also a little dated in terms of how it works. It's not very dynamic. I mean, you buy insurance for certain things, like if something happens to your aircraft, or there's some external problem. But when it comes to COVID, for example, we don't have a good mechanism of dealing with it. In fact, some of you who had travel insurances, if you didn't take the cancel for any reason clause, you would have been hit with that loss, because insurances say, well, COVID is not part of, whatever these clauses are. So the insurance market is also another one that I see undergoing a lot of change. So those are two areas where I can definitely see that happening.
And you could also see with like the bidding on upgrades, or what a marketplace would be like if you have secondhand sale of tickets. I'm a leisure traveler. You can have my Thursday seat if I can get a cash money in a flight on Friday or something like that.
That's right. The illegal stuff is already selling miles. I mean, that's not allowed. There are all these travel agencies, so-called travel agencies, which really book on people's miles. And that's because there's a small business owner who spends 100,000 on their American Express card every month and gets those 100,000 points and membership rewards. And then what people do is agencies then sell that to someone and then pay them for it. And then they book it, through that account. That's all illegal stuff as of now, even though it's very prevalent, but there are so many things like that we can do.
That's true. All right. Any other questions from the assembled Wharton group, or we'll end on some rapid fire ones?
Yeah, and by the way, I'm happy to stay afterwards for a few minutes also if anybody has questions afterwards or anything like that, so I know people have to go and all that. And I love those comments about some people actually knowing Sarah and Stephanie and Rashmi knowing the Jetsons, so I'm glad some of you know this stuff too.
All Okay, well, I'll wrap it up with some rapid fire questions that I borrowed from the Wharton Full-Time Travel Club, but window or aisle?
I love the window, but aircraft have been so packed that I tend to choose the aisle unless I'm pretty sure that the seat next to me is going to remain empty.
Awesome. And your fastest transfer time, between flights?
I think it's probably 30 or 35 minutes. And I've done it in 4 places, Phoenix, Las Vegas, these 2 for American Airlines connections. They're great for that. And in Europe, Munich and Dusseldorf.
And your favorite airline?
All Nippon, ANA. I think they have the most refined class of service. Perhaps they don't have the chic of Givenchy and all the other grooming that Singapore Airlines has, but service from the heart, the way they prepare your sushi in the galley, I mean, everything by hand, and the freshness of the food and the genuine care, ANA hands down.
And they paint their planes with Star Wars. So on the flip side, overrated airline, overrated airport or experience, something you can take or leave.
Yeah, that's actually great. That's a good question. I think so. So these guys are improving, but I think I've never understood people's love affair with British Airways. Even though, don't say this publicly, because I also have, I have Starlines, the highest status, as well as Oneworld. At least pre-COVID, I was traveling a lot. But British Airways, people were so, I don't know why, there are these loyalists who believe in it, even though the seats are cramped and the food is not always very good. The service is good. I really like them. But just the hard product has been bad for so long. And I'm just saying they're improving it. They could get away with it because they dominated Heathrow. And with charge high fares too, but I think that was overrated. Now with their new aircraft and their new seats and all that, they're improving on that.
David sent me a private question, which I think is super relevant. How many airports have you landed at but never departed from, and which are they?
Wow, that is a really interesting question.
Your open jaws. Tell us about your open jaws.
Yeah, that's right. Wow, how many airports have I landed in but not actually departed? Well, the question is, on a particular flight, I may not get out somewhere, obviously, but have I not visited the places at some point in time? This one is a little harder for me to answer. I have to think about it. I haven't done anything exotic like Uzbek Airlines or something and land somewhere, or done anything of that sort. Bolivia, no. Bogota, I also got off at. Santiago, I got off at. Oh, wow. I think this is an awesome question. Let me think about it for a second. If there's anything else that I can do that.
Challenge.
Well, that's the thing. That's a real challenge. I've never thought about that.
Well, and speaking of challenges, there's obviously going to be some flights and some United van lines moving out to Berkeley and so forth. But once this unique time passes and people are back on planes, where are you going to go first?
Oh, this is a great question. I have to do something around the world because I'm missing so many places right now. So something which covers definitely Europe and Asia and different places. So I'm gonna find some nice 3-week window or so, buy one of those round the world tickets, and then maximize on the different stops and do that and cover those places. The other place that I really want to go to, and I missed it on my last tour to Latin America, is Argentina. I went to even Colombia during that time, and I went to Chile, I went to Mexico, and a bunch of other places during this last trip in August that I have fond memories of. And I just thought, oh, Argentina, well, I'll do that the next time. And so I have to go there, so I've never been there. So I planned that. And then the other place I really want to go is Nairobi, as well as Cape Town, cover a little bit of that, some safaris and other places. So those are the things that are on my list. So I'll cover those as part of this other larger thing.
Awesome. And yeah, we'll wrap it up from my side about your favorite, your most memorable or favorite airport experience.
My most favorable airport experience, I think for different reasons. You won't believe I'm going to mention this, but one was Newark Airport, which is not a pleasant airport necessarily, but it was because they held the plane for me. It was on a flight to Germany from Newark. And they were so friendly, even though it was Lufthansa holding the flight. Everybody, for some reason, at the airport was accommodating, and they helped me, get through. And it was one of those experiences that was not stressful, which I haven't experienced in a while, and so that was really good. In terms of airport lounges, now we get to the spoiled side of things. The Lufthansa first class terminal, which is a separate terminal, like a private jet terminal, where you routinely run into actors and TV hosts and all these things. And there's a private jacuzzi that you have, and you don't actually check in. Somebody just takes your material, takes your things, and then gets your passport checked and prints everything and brings it to your seat. You're driven to the aircraft in a limo and all that. So undoubtedly, that's an experience that's there. No, I don't routinely buy first class tickets, but I do get upgraded sometimes. So in my business, that's sort of how things work. But I think those are the two memorable ones. And by the way, the reason I mentioned Newark is because I was a student at the time, a PhD student. So it wasn't that I was really, I had some status, but it wasn't the same, and no social status to speak of or anything like that. So those are the experiences that I think are most memorable. I'm sure there are many more, but we'll save those for another time.
Yeah, well, yeah, for me, it was definitely the London City, the British Airways flight, the BA1. It's the one like counter argument to your BA true tirade.
I agree. That is a great experience. Yeah.
That stop in Shannon makes it all worthwhile. So yeah, I wanted to thank you again for speaking with us, Saikat. It's really great that we got to connect with you and learn from your thoughts on M&A, and it gives us stuff to think about for our 721 class. This term and next term. You'll be in our hearts as you head out to Berkeley, and we wish you the best with that. And thanks for the large mark you left on the WEMBA and the Wharton programs.
No, thank you so much, you guys. And I'm absolutely game for getting together at any point in time once things open up. If some of you are either on the East Coast or on the West Coast, wherever, I'm very happy to have a more casual conversation about these things too, and chat with you about anything you guys like. And if anyone wants to reach out to me, please feel free to do so. I'm happy to engage. I'm passionate about this, and so I look forward to seeing you all and meeting you all in person at some point in time too.
Well, we know why you fly, and we hope that great is what you're going for. So thanks a lot, everyone, for tuning in. We'll catch you next time. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, Cliff, for organizing this. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks.
Hey, Professor, what's the best platform to reach out? Is it LinkedIn?